Hello, everyone. I'm Kim King, Chief Marketing Officer of SiteSpec. We're a leading web and mobile optimization firm serving the world's largest online businesses. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar entitled Worst Practices in Analytics with our very own Paul Terry. I can tell you that Paul's experience as a software engineer, product manager, and web analyst put him in a unique position to discover the possibilities of A/B and multivariate testing. In addition to working with SiteSpec, Paul has worked with several lead gen and e-commerce websites to improve usability and conversion rates. He sees continuous testing as a key to success in any site's evolution through first understanding user behavior and then discovering how we can change that behavior to meet our website goals. Paul holds a Bachelor of Science in Computer Science from the University of Kentucky. Without further ado, Paul, the stage is all yours.
Well, thanks, Kim. Thanks for that introduction. So the name of the talk is Worst Analytics Practices and How to Avoid Them. And today we're going to talk about tortured timing, unsolved mysteries, assembly line analytics, dead-end drudgery, overlay overload, and wretched reporting. But we're also going to talk about test planning, understanding the story, test-centered analytics, continuous experimentation, efficient traffic utilization, and quality communication. So let's get started with tortured timing. Now, what does that sound like when you hear it? It sounds like this. Marketing needs to decide by next week which way to go, and we committed to provide guidance by then. So we need to get started on this test ASAP. That's tortured timing. Now, business time requirements are a constant, but the integrity of what we're doing, the integrity of testing, requires time, an unknown amount of time. Campaign time requirements can be estimated based on traffic levels and historical KPIs, but there's always at least one variable in that equation, and that's the one you're testing. Now, early inspection is important on a test. When you launch it, you want to make sure it's working correctly, that everything you want to measure is being measured correctly. But avoid the early read and interim reporting to stakeholders. Make sure you include confidence levels for all reported findings. Maintain a prioritized list of upcoming tests. Be aware of site evolution and release schedules. For one thing, it's important to make sure you pause your tests before a release and then re-QA them after a release before you send traffic to them again. Estimate and communicate level of effort for both test setup and QA of testing, along with time and traffic estimates. It's important to educate stakeholders on the role that time plays in testing. Now, very often, stakeholders are going to want to know, how is a test going? How are the numbers coming on a certain test? Well, if you don't have statistical significance on a measurement, make sure that you say, we don't know yet, if you truly don't. If you don't have the answer, don't guess. Education of stakeholders on the role that time plays in testing and the time plays in the confidence that we have in the numbers that we have to report is critical. Okay, let's move on to unsolved mysteries. Now, what does that sound like when it comes to A/B and multivariate testing? We were surprised by the negative result of the test. The idea was disproven, but we're not sure why. Not sure why. Well, that's an unsolved mystery. The best practice is to understand the story. Every user tells a story. Every test paints a picture. Now, there's 7 questions that you should be asking yourself when you perform analytics on a campaign. What was the test hypothesis? Did the change match the hypothesis? Where did the change begin? How far did it go? Does the new story make sense? What change was unexpected? Is something obscuring my view? Now, those are the questions that you should ask yourself. Because if you can't explain the story, you can't be confident in the results. Was the test a winner or an outlier? Was the test a loser, or is it going to be a missed opportunity? The key to these questions is segmentation. What we're going to do is we're going to look at different user groups in this test. Kind of treat it like a diamond, and you're going to look at all the facets of the diamond by looking at different groups of users to both make sure that the results that you're going to report are valid and to make sure that you have a good understanding of how the story changed. We're going to break it down by browser, by devices, by refer. Where did our users in our test come from? We're going to be looking for outliers, users who showed strange behavior, or perhaps there could be a bug in the test that would come out with outliers. We're going to look at concurrent campaigns. Of course, it's possible to test users in more than one campaign, and so we want to make sure we only look at users who were in this particular campaign to make sure that it lines up with the rest of the data that we've got. First, always look at unsegmented. All visits and look at all users. When we segment, we're looking for the good. We're looking for who converted. Did more people convert, or did they convert more often? We're looking for the bad. Who didn't convert? Do we know why they didn't convert? Did we do something to maybe hinder conversion, though that probably wasn't our goal? We're going to be looking for the ugly. Who obscured? The ugly users are ones that didn't behave within a realistic constraint for a normal user. Sometimes it helps to look at first visiting campaign. These are each user's first exposure to the variation, which is the most immediate impact. We can also look at all the visits exposed to a variation. Not all the visits of a user, but only those visits that were exposed to a variation. That can help magnify the effect of a variation. Very often, a user may see the variation in one visit and convert in another. So no single view here by itself is sufficient. That's one key thing here. You've got to look at a bunch of different segments to get a good feel for the types of users that we tested, the types of users that did what we wanted, and the types of users that didn't do what we wanted to do. Understand the new story so we can understand how our variation modified our site and incented users to modify their behavior, hopefully in the direction of our hypothesis, but if not, we need to understand why. Okay, let's move on to assembly line analytics. What does that sound like? Sounds like this. We've become so good at testing, we're completing several tests per week. We've settled on an analytics template that allows us to quickly judge results and move on to the next test. Well, be careful quickly judging results and moving on too quickly. Now, analytics templates are fantastic. Analytics templates allow us to automate common tasks, provides a checklist of important ratios. It also helps to align our metrics with our enterprise analytics, double checking KPI expectations between what we have in our lab and what we have in our enterprise analytics. It helps us build confidence internally in our organization to our testing efforts and the measurements that we take. It also helps us to identify tested users within enterprise analytics, which gives us a much richer set of data to help us better understand the nature of those users and perhaps their behavior. Our SiteSpec clients have amazing extended analytics capabilities and dashboards. But what I'd like to talk about here is understanding the true impact of a variation requires a tailored reading of common response points, a unique reading of custom response points, and a sufficient sample size and duration which is going to vary per campaign and per response point. We use methods appropriate to the nature and goals of the campaign. One size does not fit all. The top of the funnel testing requires different analytical consideration and methods than the bottom of the funnel. If you are testing a landing page, for example, your expectations and your data and the story of the user changes at that phase than if you're testing in the checkout funnel. Obviously, we want to get to the checkout funnel, want to get through the checkout funnel, but what we expect of our analytics and how we look at users who accomplished early goals to get to later goals is going to be different for every test that we run, depending on where in the user's experience it is. The test fundamentals suggest the segmentation through the point of the visit of the variation, the point of the visit of the expected KPI change, visits per user at conversion, for example. Did we increase that or did we decrease it? It's going to obviously be very different per campaign. A lot of good points to look at depending on the nature and the type of the test that we're running. Per user analytics, this is important. In SiteSpec, the default is per visit. It's very often very important to look at per user. Look at both of them and compare them. One looks at all the visits that a user had together as a user, and the other is on a per visit basis. Now, the whole point of testing is to modify user behavior. So it's more important at the end of the day to look at per user analytics, especially if, again, that visits per user at conversion. If we change that equation, we want to make sure we encompass in our analytics the entire user experience, all of the visits that the user was exposed to during the test. Okay, now let's move on to dead-end drudgery. Sounds like this. We had high hopes for a variation we tested, but the results were tepid and kind of weird. Guess we were wrong. Oh, the pain, the pain. Dead end. You know, you put a test together, you have a hypothesis, you run the test, and it's kind of strange, tepid. A few things weren't what we expected at all. Well, don't say, oh well. The most exciting phrase to hear in science, the one that heralds new discoveries, is not Eureka, I found it, but that's funny. This is a quote from Isaac Asimov that everyone should have on their mind when they're conducting tests and doing analytics for tests. Let's look at our testing lifecycle. We have a hypothesis, we conduct a test, we analyze the results, and then we make a recommendation and hopefully deploy a change to our site that will increase conversion. But there's a major step missing from this lifecycle, and that is repeat, because your recommendation some of the time may be to deploy or not to deploy a change. But probably about half the time it should be a recommendation for a new test or a change in the test. Finding winners often requires multiple tests. We want to maximize lift. We want to balance competing goals. Very often there's more than one thing that we would like our users to accomplish on a page. And when we sometimes help one of those goals, we may hinder another goal. So we have to balance those competing goals out. That takes time. It takes multiple tests very often to understand, first to truly understand what we're doing, but then to be able to lift all boats and balance competing goals. Remove an obstacle to success. We may have inadvertently added an obstacle into our test. Maybe we didn't perceive the user experience quite right. And so this is how we learn by a test. When we look at the nature of our site, kind of I like to say in 3 dimensions, because we're making a change and seeing what happens. It gives you a great perspective to see that 3rd dimension, see the importance of different changes, see how our users will modify their behavior based on our expectations. Some of the best ideas, testing ideas, come from the results of other tests. I would say that the best tests you ever run, the best changes that you find are going to require multiple tests in order to discern those out. Now let's go on to overlay overload. What does that sound like? Sounds like this. We need to run more tests, so let's run more tests in a campaign set with overlay. SiteSpec allows you to test a user in more than one campaign at the same time. We talked about this earlier. Now, this can be a very powerful thing to do, but it also can be dangerous, and this is what I want to talk about. If you change the page in more than one way, if there are two different changes, how do you attribute the modification of behavior to one of those changes or the other one of those changes? This is what I call the dirty test tube syndrome. If we're having multiple tests on common pages with common KPIs, it's difficult or impossible to discern the effect and attribute it to one variation or the other. If we're changing the page in multiple ways with multiple tests, you can create unpredictable variations. And it can require larger sample requirements in order to get enough data to actually do the discerning between one campaign or another, and that's going to require longer testing times. Now, the best practice here is optimize traffic utilization. If we want to run more tests, we want to have more traffic available for testing, we need to use it better, right? So assignment criteria is a way to, through many different parameters of user behavior, assign users to test based on their prior behavior to this point, or the nature of their device or their browser. There's many options there, but this will allow us to only put users in tests who are qualified candidates for a particular test, and will allow us to waste less traffic. We can combine similar tests to share a control. If we have several tests running, each with its own control, and they're all running on the same page, we can very simply have one test with multiple variations, each variation implementing one of these other tests. That will cut down on the number of on the amount of traffic, because we can have one control and then say 3 variations instead of 3 controls and 3 variations and 3 separate tests. It's a great way to save traffic and be more efficient in its use. A/B or multivariate testing. Always good to make a prudent choice here. Multivariate tests are very powerful, but they can also, especially in the early stages, take a lot of traffic before we do a lot of pruning. So make a good judgment there whether you want to use the traffic from multivariate if you're getting tight on traffic. Experiments with overlay can be very powerful and very often can be the only way to test. If we're testing on an obscure page, a rare use case, or unique KPIs, these are times in which running an experiment in overlay is the right way to go. And what I mean by that is a user can be in multiple tests at the same time. For example, if we're testing something in a help page or a page that's not looked at very often, and we're not judging the same thing, we're not judging conversion in this point, or we're not judging add to cart, we're not judging lead submission, we're judging something unique and different. So that way anybody that's in any test in the site can also be in this obscure test, multiple obscure tests, and that if they happen to go to the part of the site that we are testing in, then they can be included in that test as well. So it can be very powerful with overlay. But again, that's not a dirty test tube, because we're not changing two things on a user that are going to impact the same KPI. Okay, let's move on to Wretched Reporting. Now, what does this sound like? We actually have 2 of these. This is Wretched Reporting 101. All we did is change the marketing message in one place and demonstrated a 10% lift in site conversions. Okay, that's what our reporting is, and it's a little scary, and let's talk about why. Results must be put into context when judging the site-wide impact of a change. And the reason is we didn't necessarily test every single user that came to the site. Look at your percent counted metric. In a test, the user has to see the variation in order to be counted in the test, or the same place in the control. So usually not every user is counted in the test. Also, we talked about the importance of segmentation. If you are segmenting your results, make sure you fully explain that segmentation when you report out your results. Don't leave it segmented and say, well, this is the site-wide change, because it's not, because you've segmented. It's only a segment of users. We've got the segment of users that are counted in the test because they saw the variation, but then you may have further segmentation that you've done to discern those differences. So be careful about reporting on segmented results. Most campaigns do not and should not test all users. Again, so it's fine to test on a subset of users to understand the difference between the variation and the control, but then the extrapolation can be difficult, so be careful and treat that with caution. An example is a variation to the product page lifts conversion by X%. Reporting that the change will lift site conversion by X% forgets that Y% of users never see the product page. That's version number 1. Now, Wretched Reporting 102 is like this. 2 variations tested showed site-wide lifts of 1% and 2%, and we mean true site-wide lifts this time. Those 2 variations are included in the release this morning, so we should now be halfway to our quarterly goal of lifting conversion by 6%. Well, the math kind of works there, but let's look at this. The effects of combined changes may not be cumulative. You can't necessarily run a variation A and a variation B and get both 2 winners there and then combine the values. You really have no idea whether those combined lifts are going to result in a combined lift number. You also probably had some things in that release that you didn't test, right? And you have no idea of the effects on those on conversion. You may have run a test during, for example, the holiday season, and then you're deploying perhaps in the next quarter, and you're trying to say that the holiday type lift is going to be the strong type lift is going to be the same. So there could be a seasonality variation there. The best practice here is to never predict overall site conversion for a release. Just don't do it. You're not in that business, and you really can't do that. Focus on supporting directional improvements, and just don't be in the prediction business. Communication and results. Make sure that you prescribe precisely who was tested and who was counted. Include variation and control screenshots. Remember, your site will live and live and live and change all the time. So include those control screenshots, variation and control, so that you can document the test that you've run. Include the dates and times of testing and the statistical significance for each response point. 90% should normally be the minimum for reported results. Some organizations use 95. Keep a test catalog of historical results of all the tests that you run. Maintain a blog available to stakeholders so that they can reference the tests that you've done in the past times, and will help give insight into how to design new tests, or perhaps to revisit old tests as our sites evolve. So that's quality communication. So today we've talked about tortured timing and how it became test planning. We've talked about unsolved mysteries and how it became understanding the story. We saw assembly line analytics become test-centered analytics. Dead-end drudgery become continuous experimentation. Overlay overload became optimized traffic utilization. And wretched reporting became quality communications. And you add all these up, and you get happy testing. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. That was an excellent overview of what not to do and what you should do when it comes to looking at the data. That was very helpful. Thank you. I think we have some time for questions. And the first question would be, how do you know what to test and how to prioritize testing ideas?
Well, that's a great question. I would say start strategically. Find a KPI that's not performing the way you'd like, and focus on different strategies to improve the KPI. And then moving on from that, talk to your stakeholders and your site designers about their visions and about how they'd like to evolve the website. Often the biggest obstacle to change is risk, right? So what we're able to do is mitigate that risk. So you can make small changes to problematic KPIs, but then you can also help mitigate the risk of making larger changes on an evolutionary path that your stakeholders envision.
I love that. I love starting with what matters most. That makes a lot of sense. So, how do you know who in the organization should be involved in testing?
Well, the short answer is everyone. Everyone should be involved, beginning with executive management and all throughout your organization. Solicit ideas from everyone, from all roles in site design and business development. It's critical that executive management understands and commits to testing. Now, in your team, you'll probably start off with one or two people, depending on your team, and they're going to do all the tasks involved in testing. But as your team demonstrates how powerful testing is and brings on more folks, then there are three major practices involved: test implementation, test QA, and test analytics.
Great. That makes a lot of sense. So, how do you know when you have enough data for a test? What does that look like?
Well, first off, SiteSpec tells you when you have enough data. It's something called statistical significance. And SiteSpec shows it for each measurement, whether you have enough data to rely on the metric. But the other thing to say is our websites have natural cycles, right? So we have times when we're busy, times during the day, during the week, and throughout the year. What's important is to make sure within the framework of what you want to test that we capture multiple cycles, multiple days, evenings, weeks, and be aware of how seasonality may influence user behavior too. We want to capture multiple cycles up and down. So those two key concepts, cycles and statistical significance, are how you know when you have enough data.
Great. Thank you, Paul. Hey, before we go, I'd like to tell our audience a little bit about SiteSpec in case you aren't already familiar with us. We are the only optimization platform that enables you to test everything on your site and target everyone. So you can test everything from how it looks, such as images, layout, copy, colors, and other front-end usability items, to how your site works, including back-end functionality such as pricing and shipping experimentation. If you'd like to learn more, I would encourage you to register for a demo through the link below. I want to thank everyone for participating in this webinar today. Thanks very much, everyone, and have a great day.